in that Act much clearer and much more deliverable.
My Lord, to follow the noble Lord, and I think already in this very short but very interesting debate, we've seen the problem that the government essentially is seeking to address a failure of leadership in many of our universities by legislation which, from the amendments we've seen today, to me, would suggest that this is going to be very, very hard to implement. And my lords, I remain unconvinced that this really is the right way to tackle what is undoubtedly a problem in our universities. I first came across this meeting Professor Kathleen Stock when she was subject to horrific abuse in her own university for simply saying that your biological sex cannot be changed by feelings of identity, which I think are quite unexceptional and certainly legal remarks. Many other women academics in universities have felt themselves to be threatened and censored for the simple act of trying to engage in these kind of debates, particularly in relation to women's sex-based rights. And unfortunately, many universities have allowed abusive behaviour to go unchallenged. And at the heart of it, it seems to me is a question as to, even at this late stage, whether we can look to universities to put their house in order, which I think would be a much more appropriate way forward than, frankly, seeking to implement what I'm convinced is going to be wildly impractical legislation. And our arguments or debates, very civilised debates, already over what we mean by free speech seems to me to suggest this is going to be a huge problem when it comes to implementation. I do think, my lords, I do think the recent survey by the Higher Education Policy Institute, which showed a distinct shift in attitude of students who, they say, have a different conception of academic freedom and free speech norms than earlier generations, and they suggest that these may have swung too far in one direction, with relatively few students recognising the unavoidable trade-offs involved with even greater restrictions on legal free speech. And HEPI have actually come up with a list of things that they think the universities might take forward, which seem very sensible to me. Reassessing formal procedures such as existing codes of practice, ensuring consistent good practice such as balancing controversial speakers with other speakers, giving students improved information on academic norms included in fresher weeks. And I still think, my lords, it might be better if OFS and HEPI and universities were allowed to work this through together. And indeed, I'd suggest to the Noble Earl, the Minister, that if I were him, I would delay the date the bill came into force in order to give universities time to try and change the culture and atmosphere within universities. I think this would be a much more practical and effective way of going forward. However, my lords, if the government is determined to press ahead, then clearly it needs to answer a lot of questions about the practical implementation of what they're proposing and guidance which is going to be given to universities. And this is the reason for my Amendment 25, and it's the question as to how far intimidatory tactics against people speaking in universities are to be allowed under this legislation. Now, we've seen intimidatory tactics. They can take a range of forms, including open letters demanding an academic should be sacked for what they've said, vexatious complaints, petitions to publishers demanding that work could be withdrawn, campaigns of defamation and smears, demands to prevent an academic from being platformed, attempts to prevent events from going ahead by threatening trouble if they do, and disrupting events that do go ahead. And the targets of these tactics are typically women who believe that sex matters and have the courage to say so. Now, one possible response to these kind of attacks is to frame the attempt to silence as itself a form of free speech. But this, of course, then confuses the right to protest with a right to silence others. Speech that's merely intended to silence the speech of others, far from contributing to knowledge and learning, narrows the scope of the educational sphere. And I'd argue to frame attempts to silence as equally valued speech ignores the educational purpose of the university. So the amendment explicitly excludes attempts to silence the speech of others from the scope of the core secure duty under the bill, and requires universities to take positive steps to mitigate the effects of those exercising what has been described as the heckler's veto without disproportionately affecting the right to lawful protest. It also provides clarity that the use of what I've described as the heckler's veto to silence legitimate debate and dampen academic freedom on campus is not in itself protected speech. My Lords, it is a probing amendment because I want to hear what the government has to say about our concept of free speech and how far it goes and what is to be done with intimidatory tactics. But, my Lords, I am still left with the sense that this bill, as it stands, is unworkable and is going to be an absolute nightmare for universities to implement. If only universities had shown leadership in the last few years, this wouldn't have been necessary.
To my Lord.